Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to this inaugural struggle session, a new recurring live stream panel series on my channel. And we are now live. East is a podcast, viewers. It is also streaming there right now. And if you like that show, I think you're going to like this one. So make sure to come over to @Adnan Hussein Show. And everyone who's online right now, please like the stream so that we can boost it on the algorithm. And while you're there, you may as well subscribe to the channel so you can keep up to date with future videos. I'm Adnan Hussein, and you know me also as co-host of Guerrilla History. I'm a medieval Mediterranean and Islamicate world historian, and I'm really delighted to be here with you all, and especially to be sporting my new Club Palestino jersey that I just got yesterday. So I have to shout out Dr. Gabriela. She just finished her PhD, but she is from Chile, and she arranged to have this brought directly from Santiago, and I think it's the most gorgeous and apropos soccer jersey in the world. So I'm really excited to be here with you and to kick off the struggle sessions. This show has a family resemblance with Tankie Group Therapy that I know has been absolutely invaluable to so many during this nearly 2 years of genocide in Gaza. But there are a couple of differences. This is a live stream show, so I'm really excited by the possibility that we can have more engagement and interaction with you in the audience. So put your comments and queries in the YouTube chat that you want to pose to the panel, and we'll try and get to them. But we already have several comments and questions and topics from patrons. And so if you'd like to support this show and make sure you get your questions posed to the panel, you can join on patreon.com/Adnan Hussein. The other difference is that unlike Tankie Group Therapy, we're not here necessarily to make you feel better. And given everything that's happening in the world, we may not actually make you feel better. But what we do want to do is arm and equip you better for action, for our struggles for social justice and liberation. And to help us do that, we'll be convening panels of activists, experts, and scholars on this struggle session and future editions. And this edition is no exception, with a wonderful group of discussants. Alex Avina is a historian and well known to many of you. He's been on Tankie Group Therapy. He's a frequent guest on Guerrilla History and other shows. And we have an upcoming episode that I hope you'll check out about the uprisings in LA, questions of immigration and fascism in the United States. Alex, thanks for coming on to the inaugural struggle session.
No, thank you for the invitation, Adnan. And in solidarity with you, I had to do my Palestino football jersey as well. So, but yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. And Nora Barrows Friedman is an editor at the Electronic Intifada, a writer, and of course, as you all know, co-host of the indispensable Electronic Intifada podcast and live streams. It's great to see you, Nora. Thanks so much for making time to join us.
Thank you so much for putting this together. It's a huge honor to be with all of you today.
Well, likewise, and I hope it's useful to listeners. That's what we'll endeavor to do. And Nina Farnia is a professor of law and a legal historian, and you really should catch her 2 recent appearances on the Red Nation, talking about the Iran situation and other issues. I'm really so delighted that you could join us, Nina.
Thank you, Adnan. I'm actually a big fan of Tankie Group Therapy, so it's an honor to be here with you all. I'm not sure I'm as witty as some of you, but I'll try to keep up.
Well, I mean, this show is about analysis, and I know, listeners and viewers are going to really appreciate the cogent and, incisive analysis that you have to bring. But not only the world in the Middle East, West Asia as a whole, but also in the United States. And that's kind of where I wanted to start. principally because, the online sphere has been abuzz domestically because of the victory by a certain candidate, Zohran Kwame Mamdani, in the New York mayoral Democratic primary. And there's a lot of different ways to go about talking about it, but I thought I would start perhaps a little bit in getting your thoughts in response to a patron comment and remark that first was offered us a challenge that if we could just limit our discussion of the Mamdani issue to 10 minutes max, since Peapod believes that it's been highly inflated and getting a lot of attention. I don't think we'll be able to do that because there are so many different angles to discuss, but it's less for us to be thrilled and excited, I think, about the victory, but really to analyze what it means and what it might portend going forward. And Peapod linked an article by Abdul Jawad Omar in Mondoweiss about how Zohran Mamdani's victory marks the end of Israel's central place in U.S. politics, which sounds to me like a controversial thesis that I think would be worth really thinking about. So what are the implications of this victory? I'll want to talk a little bit about, the reactions to it, because I think those really are quite telling as well. But before we get to those, what do you think is the meaning and the political, what kind of political analysis should we have about Zohran Mamdani's primary victory? I'm starting maybe Nora, you might have some thoughts on this.
Oh boy, hot seat. I'm of several minds about this, and I've been going back and forth for days since the election about how to articulate this. I think it signifies things about where we're at in this moment that are important. He is a longtime activist. I think he was very involved in Students for Justice in Palestine about a decade ago. I actually interviewed him a few years ago for the Electronic Intifada for a print article I wrote about a New York City bill that he was sponsoring, as I think he was like an assemblyman or something at the time, that was trying to make NYC an apartheid-free community, something like that. And he was working with Bassel Adra, who is from Masafriyata and who co-directed the film, that won the Oscar, No Other Land, which I have serious critiques of, and I know we all do. But just that's all to say that he has been active in the Palestine movement for a long time. He, is kind of, a well-known, DSA figure. He kind of, there are things that I think in general are good about him. I think that he is, he's charismatic. He is talking about, things that need to be done in New York in terms of rent control and workers' rights and lifting up the working class and, taxing the billionaires and all the things that are fine and good. And of course, we have these very valid skepticisms and reason to be skeptical of him, because he is now officially part of the Democratic Party establishment. We saw what happened with AOC and how she was pretty much a Trojan horse where she said, very exciting things when she was getting elected as a congressperson. She had very similar kind of like branding, charisma, youngest, woman from the Bronx, Queens, I can't remember. And, Puerto Rican, and she said, fine things about Palestine at the time. And then she got kind of put into the channel of like, bending the knee to the establishment, becoming besties with Nancy Pelosi and helping Bernie Sanders sell out real working class politics in favor of a Democratic Party war machine. And so I think, I love seeing Zionists and establishment Democrats freak out. Like, that's always fantastic. We need to see more of that. We need to see more of, their kind of panic and spiraling. That's always good and fine to see. But I fear that there is now going to be a pacification mechanism with Zohran if he is elected mayor. And I have these tensions, I think, within myself where I'm like, electoral politics in the belly of the beast and the imperial core are ineffective at best and dangerous at worst. And anyone who wants to be a representative of this empire is someone who should never be trusted. Why are we spending all this time celebrating someone who is most likely going to sell out, our values and whatnot. So I'm kind of just taking a step back and seeing where this is going to go. And I think, I don't know. I don't know how much energy the real left, the tanky left have in trying to hold yet another DSA elected official accountable for like stupid shit that they're inevitably going to say about Palestine, about Zionism. I mean, he's already saying stuff about, Jewish fears, which are completely absurd and a fantasy. And that is really distressing to see. So I don't know. I hope, I hope for the best. I hope he does the right thing. I hope he has a moral center. I hope he has people around him who are going to say, hey, let's not go to Chuck Schumer's house for dinner and pretend like, genocide is a necessary evil sort of thing, just to placate, the big wigs in power in your community. I don't know. So I'm kind of just like, there's an opportunity here, and it signifies that there is this shift that's taking place where, the regular tricks of the Democratic Party and the Zionist lobby groups did not play well in this election. And that's significant. That's something that we should interrogate and use it as a way to say, you don't have now, the Israel lobby, you don't have to placate the Israel lobby in order to get elected maybe anymore. So let's kind of just see what happens and keep going harder. Okay. Yeah. We have, maybe this one guy who's going to do something as mayor. We'll see, again, very skeptical, very cautious. But what this signifies is that the Zionist narrative is not as fearsome as it used to be, that there are ways around, the kind of established avenues of trying to quote unquote enact change in our communities that don't involve Israel and supporting the genocidal apartheid state. And that, I think, is due to the just level of disgust that most people feel around Israel now, and that there is like this growing public revulsion at Israel and the US's MO of propping up Israel at every turn. So I don't know. I mean, maybe this signifies something, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I think that was 10 minutes. I'm so sorry.
No, that's great. I mean, I think quite apart from the skepticism we might have about his potential future performance, and of course, everybody just remember it's only the primary. And even though typically the Democratic primary winner becomes mayor of New York, I mean, people are forgetting what happened to India Walton in Buffalo. She won the primary, but then, her opponent, who was supported by the establishment, ran with all of their, the party's support as an independent and defeated her there. And so, we know that there are many more stages to this process. But quite apart from that, I think that's the real question. What you were pointing out is whether or not this is a significant change in the salience of the Zionist narrative and the Zionist lobby when it comes to disciplining U.S. politicians. Has the political culture actually changed? And maybe even more than that, I would pose the question to Alex and Nina about whether or not, as some may even think, the Palestine solidarity movement, in fact, actually was perhaps a bit of an asset to him in his candidacy, partly because, unlike, say, Jeremy Corbyn, who was totally derailed, as we know from your colleague, Nora, Asa Winstanley's wonderful book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, that playing some kind of the game and apologizing for, anti-Semitism in the Labor Party when there was evidence of none, and ignoring the real sources of anti-Semitism and where they come from, really derailed his candidacy. And we saw that Zohran Mamdani did not back away and condemn chants like globalize the Intifada or from the river to the sea. And if he has sort of talked about boosting funding to kind of allay concerns or fears or try to respond to concerns that are being circulated in the Zionist community about, increase in anti-Semitism, he could have perhaps have handled those better. He could have, talked about, there is rising anti-Semitism and it's coming from the right. And it's been for a few years under the Trump administration. That would, since the kind of populist right-wing movement, both in Europe and the United States, that would have been, I think, a more powerful kind of statement. But so that's the question.
Just dismissing. There is no anti-Semitism is an institutional bigotry. There is no institutional anti-Semitism anymore. Yes, there are like disgusting racist bigots, who hate Jews and want us to all convert to Christianity or else burn in hell or whatever. But there's no institutional push to deny Jews jobs or houses or healthcare or university admissions or like entry to other countries. There's no sanctioned, legalized institutional anti-Semitism. And so he could have said what is actually factually true, which is that fears because you're being criticized for supporting a literal genocide is not anti-Semitism. It is not a thing that needs to be addressed or like build a task force around. That conversation, that argument needs to be shut down. And I think the time is way past that. And I think Zohran, by playing into that, whether it was like Stephen Colbert or whoever else, I think he was on like Meet the Press this morning. I didn't watch it. But still, what Corbyn did was that. And Corbyn was, it was a really bad move where he played into the imagined and artificial, made up fears by wealthy, privileged white Jewish people in Britain, who said that, if you criticize our spare settler state of apartheid and genocide and Holocaust, then that means it's an anti-Semitism, and we can't have that. And unfortunately, Corbyn apologized, and he gave them an inch. You never give them an inch. You shut it down. You say, no, Israel does not have a right to exist because no state has a right to exist. People have a right to exist. And I think the more that he tries to placate and play into that argument, this level of like imagined persecution against a people who are not being persecuted and who are having their imagined quote unquote fears coddled and cared for at the expense of a real people who are being really genocided. I think that's just going to be that's the wrong path. I think we need to see people say there is no anti-Semitism happening. There is a genocide happening. And the people who are being genocided are not being allowed any sort of comfort or task forces or, I think that yes, there is anti-Semitism in ideology in the right and the white supremacists and the Nazis that are in Europe, because that is a European thing. But it is not institutionalized. And I think that needs to be emphasized over and over again.
Absolutely. I'm wondering if, Nina, you have any thoughts on this, and also what you think about whether perhaps the Palestine solidarity movement was actually an asset, as a constituted social force in New York politics this time.
Yeah. So I live in New York. I live in Albany, but I'm a recent transplant from California. So it's actually really an interesting place politically. I'm gonna maybe answer your question from a different angle, Adnan, which is to say that he definitely benefited from the Palestine movement here, which is very, very strong, especially in New York City. But I think what his campaign really reflects is the crisis of capital. I don't think I don't think his campaign, I don't think he's going to have much to do or say about US imperialism or the genocide or Zionism. I think he really wrote in on the state of capital in the US and specifically in New York. And the craziest thing about his victory is that the Democratic Party, in the capital of global finance, the historical capital of global finance, in probably the most important city for the Democratic Party machine, they could not put up a legitimate candidate to beat him. That's ridiculous. The best they could find was Cuomo, which signals what a lot of folks were saying maybe a year ago, especially like people from the Black Alliance for Peace and other organizations, that the Democratic Party is dying. It's on life support. And so I think that's what's happening. I think that's really interesting. As for Zoran's campaign and himself, he's a very charismatic figure. He has a lot of, to have like a successful Hollywood film director behind you, and then a super successful intellectual behind you, helping you shape your script and your narrative and the angle of the camera and the lighting and all this stuff, right? Like, I think if he hadn't won the primary, it would have been a bit of a surprise, frankly. But I agree with Nora. Like, how many times are we going to have this conversation about individuals changing and making any meaningful changes in a capitalist state? And then in the heart of finance capital, right? If he is able to pass universal childcare, pre-K, or bring life back into rent control, or the grocery store initiative that he's talking about now, I would be shocked. If he wins, and then he's able to do any one of these things in the heart of finance capital, I would be shocked. Hopefully he can. But ultimately, these are very modest changes. I mean, we are talking about access to food, something that is taken for granted as a right in much of the world. So the fact that we're at this level, the dialogue is at this level, childcare so people can work, food, shelter, not even like free shelter, but just like, shelter that is less than thousands of dollars a month. This is very, it's a sad state of affairs, frankly. And if he's able to do it, kudos to him. Is it going to radically transform New York City? No. Is it going to radically transform the United States? No. How much longer are people in the United States going to continue to have these conversations? I don't know. I hope they smell the roses. Karen Bass in LA is a perfect example. She rode in out of the New Left into that and out of South Central, out of South LA, into that seat. And look at what is happening in LA now. Alex can speak to it much better than me. She came straight out of the left, out of the New Left. So I respect the organizations that are supporting him in New York City. That's what they should do because they have membership in New York City, and I support that. Is this going to radically transform anything? No. Is it going to radically transform the situation in Palestine or in West Asia? Definitely not. Any victories that we have in the region have nothing to do with what happens in New York electoral politics.
Yeah, Alex, did you want to chime in on anything?
Yeah, I think since Tuesday, my face has been kind of like that screenshot of Ta-Nehisi Coates' face when he's like, that was racist. My biggest takeaway is to see the racism and the Islamophobia that we've seen directed at this one young man who's running for office. I mean, it's so that I think we can learn a lot from that. We can come back to that if you want, but yeah, like our comrade Jay from Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, right? He talks about the Democratic Party being the place where social movements go to die, and him and numerous of his guests, brilliant scholars that he's talked to, have talked about how the Democratic Party serves almost as like a counterinsurgent co-optation machine, and we've seen this for a while, right? I mean, I think about even myself, right? Like in 2007, 2008, thinking that Obama was going to represent, like being conflicted, right? On the one hand, thinking, okay, this guy is going to represent something new, but then as a historian in training, I'm like, I don't think so, right? And I remember when I lived in Mexico in that moment, and I had these like ex-guerrilla fighters that I was interviewing for my project, having great hope, right, that Obama was going to represent something differently. And then I was like this like young shitty grad student telling them like, well, I don't know if we should be really, I don't know if that's going to really happen. But then after he wins, right, like one of the images I have seared into my mind is like at one of these first like inter-American conferences, like Hugo Chavez goes up to Obama, shakes his hand, and then gives him a copy of Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America book. So there's also about like how people outside the U.S. receive these electoral victories, which is in many ways like, and in many instances different than the way that those of us living in the entrails of the belly of the beast like see it, right? And I think that's important to think about it as well. Like there is a, and this is maybe speaks a little bit to the article that you brought up, Adnan. There is an international component to this, at least at the level of representation, that most Americans will not engage with. And I think we should. I think it's important. And we can also come back to that as well. And I totally agree with Nina, right? Like, I think it's sad to see that the policies that Mamdani is proposing are seen as so radical when they represent such a like historical regression, right? Like they represent like a total victory of the monsters, of the rich, of the capitalists. That I think about like people like Bill Ackman and other capitalists who came out so strong again after Mamdani's victory. And like, I'm thinking about, like, what are you people afraid of? Like, I think about the great CLR James's line from his book on the Haitian Revolution, where he's like, you know, basically, we only get change when rich people are running, fearing for their lives. These people are afraid of like a 1 or 2% income tax raise. They're afraid of a pilot program for government-sponsored grocery stores, one in each of the 5 boroughs. What are they afraid of? They used to be afraid of the Russian Revolution. What are they afraid of now? They have everything. They've won everything. And then we get a very reformist politician promising to, in a minimal way, mitigate the worst excess of capital. And and we get this freak out moment, and this freak out is represented in a variety of different ways, like Nora was saying about how the way that they weaponize anti-Semitism, the way that they, you know, I mean, I want to break something when I see Lawrence Summers like chiming in, like, dude, like, you are one of the like, you know, it's the hot dog guy meme. You're one of we're here because of you to a certain extent. But I think about, like, what are these ultra wealthy capitalists really afraid of, right? Like, they've been running amok since 1991. Like, what are they really afraid of? And the fact that they're afraid of him, I think, says something. I think we need to engage with that in a serious way. You know, regardless of our feelings about the Democratic Party being the place where social movements go to die, we've seen this, right? There's no theory of power. And I think this is something that the left in the US at least, has to account for. Like, we failed in this regard. What other theory of power do we have other than explicitly or implicitly saying we are going to either take over the Democratic Party from the inside, or from the outside, we're going to pressure them to be something that they are not. And what we've seen since Tuesday, in the midst of a massively unpopular US imperialist strike in Iran, amidst a massively unpopular big beautiful bill that is an embarrassing, outlandish transfer of wealth from the poorest of this country to the wealthiest in this country, a massively unpopular bill. What are these Democrats? We've seen ICE raids happening, like terrorism on our streets. And what do we see these today on the Sunday shows? What are these Democratic Party leaders talking about? They're talking about this guy in New York, about whether he said globalize the Intifada, or like that racist Gillibrand saying that he said globalize jihad. Like, so again, so I think something is if we consider ourselves to be part of the left within the US, within the belly of the beast, to once again refer to Jose Marti, like, we have to account for our failure to develop a theory of power that can actually work. And listen, like, I'm not gonna. We can shit on DSA in many different ways. They have a theory of power, and it's utterly failed. Like, 2 Bernie campaigns have utterly failed. Bernie's performance since October 7th, 2023 has been an embarrassment. So part of me thinks, well, someone like Mamdani, that's like, is that all we can get? Is that all we can get? I mean, and that's fine, right? But no, it's not fine. But like, is it like, if it is, then okay, we have to re-articulate like a theory of power and a theory of politics that takes that into account, and start believing that we can convince people like Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries to end the genocide in Gaza. On the other hand, and I'll shut up after this. What I do find interesting, though, is that Palestine did. I agree. I think Palestine did help him win. And I think that says something about how Palestine sunk the Democrats last year. And part of the Democratic Party response to Mamdani and not paying attention to Gaza, to this genocide, and then focusing on Trump and focusing on the far right. That's part of a broader intellectual and political discourse of the last few years, where you have liberals essentially focusing on the right, focusing on people like Trump as a way to explicate the failures of liberalism. And that's also a big component. Like, we don't have Trump without Obama. And we still have a political party that refuses to acknowledge their responsibility in creating this monster. And I think that's also something that we need to keep in mind. And the last thing, the last thing, one thing I did appreciate about Mamdani, in addition to everything that Nina and Nora have mentioned, is that he did go and confront Homan, this horrific, just terrible representation of a ICE border patrol migrant Nazi, in which I'm really hoping hypertension will do its thing sooner rather than later. At the very least, him and people like Brad Lander, we can say all things about him as well. But at the very, they are acting, they are doing something against ICE terrorism, which the party that they belong to or they are a part of in some way has really refused to engage. Instead, as Nina said, we have Karen Bass, a actual member of the Venceremo brigades who went to Cuba in the early 70s, is now providing cover for ICE agents in LA by allowing LAPD to protect ICE agents while they're conducting their state terrorism campaigns. And she finds all sorts of ways to kind of say that she's not doing what she's doing. People want to see action in a certain way. And there's a variety of opportunities where we can actually see action. So at the very least, at a minimal level, Mamdani did it at least at one time when he tried to confront Tom Homan.
Very interesting. I think you're absolutely right that we do need some kind of theory and practice of power. The failures that you've mentioned, and the example of somebody like Karen Bass, just shows how much the world and the context has changed under neoliberalism the last 4 decades and so on. But also what I see in the anxious reactions that you also highlighted, Alex, from the 1%, from the kind of Zionist imperialist elites who control society, the fact that they seem to feel their hold over society. Either they're so incredibly used to getting their way and greedy that they just can't, respond to any reduction of privilege, which I'm certainly willing to credit. But I do think there is an anxiousness because there have been popular mobilizations that have been successfully derailed, as we've been mentioning, the Bernie campaigns and so on. They know that there is massive discontent, and that discontent also manifests itself on the populist right. And what we see is that they also have absolutely no program. So we're in this sort of remarkable period where Western politicians have absolutely nothing to offer their people other than Islamophobia. I mean, that's all, anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia. These are the only things holding together in any kind of integral way, Western polities, it seems, because that's the only program of what they can offer. And you see that in the reactions to Mamdani's, electoral victory in the Democratic primary. I mean, the kinds of there were 2 components of it. One is that he's a communist. Okay, so that gets back to the kind of class. But, what's interesting is that is such a generic, charge at this point that I'm not sure what that means to people anymore and what context, especially for youth, people under 40 who don't remember the Cold War. I'm a little older. I do remember the Cold War. That would have had some kind of resonance. People would have had in mind something like the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, etc. But that doesn't exist. So I just wonder, what does that mean to people now? But what they do have is Islamophobia, fears of the caliphate coming, and I mean, I've seen some incredible memes and some incredible sort of tweets from people trying to connect, of course, the ambient Islamophobia that is the only glue or integument for their sense of identity and sense of a polity, any meaningful politics, with the kind of question of immigration, migrants, and so forth. And so you had somebody like Stephen Miller, saying this is an example of like what happens when you don't, control migration. And it's true. All those white settlers who came over have truly destroyed this land. So, the indigenous people of Manhattan, should have never allowed, these white settlers to come in. But I think the other kind of element is this idea of what constitutes citizenship. We're seeing a real clarification that there isn't a sense of equal. I mean, if anybody thought there was equality of citizenship, I mean, we're seeing that some people, if they've been naturalized and they're not from the right, kind of ethnic and cultural and religious and political background, then they should be denaturalized and deported. This Andy Ogles, a representative from Tennessee, called for that and received quite a lot of support and people joining his calls and so forth. The only interesting point that I saw by one of these right-wing xenophobes and Islamophobes was Matt Gaetz, with his recognition that this is one reason why he doesn't support, and maybe almost the only one in MAGA world who's an elected official, doesn't support these like wars abroad, because he connects U.S. intervention and imperial, and he wouldn't put it in these terms, but U.S. interventions, military involvement abroad with creating the conditions of disorder for mass displacement of people as refugees. And of course, it isn't only that, it's capitalism itself and the entire, unequal structure, unequal exchange, and its devastating consequences, climate change, which is also a byproduct of this totally unsustainable, dirty capitalism. But he is correct that, that's actually a kind of coherent, if fascistic and bigoted position, that if you want your kind of fantasy of a, white America, you can't, be causing, having these wars abroad and putting people, into, conditions of being refugees and so on. So it's just interesting to me how important and significant Islamophobia is in providing the only rationale for Western politics. I don't know if anybody else has anything else they want to, mention about that. The only other, I thought it would be interesting also at some point to think about, the reaction to Sadiq Khan, who is mayor in London. I think there was a similar kind of paranoia, Islamophobia. And so we'll be, watching to see, how that plays out if indeed he is, elected. But that reminds me that, of course, beyond these shores, there's a whole world where genocide is taking place and where, there's been attacks upon, Iran. And before getting into that and any of those topics that you might want to raise yourselves, I just want to remind viewers and listeners to like the stream. If you like the stream, more of your friends and comrades will hear about it on their feeds. And, please do share it. Let people know about this discussion that's taking place. So subscribe, like, share. Nina, I'm wondering if you had any topics you wanted to raise. You've had some interesting discussions recently that I've seen online about the situation, sort of analysis of the situation in the Israeli-U.S. war on Iran. But I wondered if you had a topic that you wanted to raise.
I can just talk about that, and I would love to hear what you all think. Those 2 weeks, those 12 days, and I think this bears repeating, so I will repeat it, were monumental. They were perhaps two of the most important weeks politically for us, the peoples of the region, and its refugees, and really for U.S. imperialism. And also, I would add, for this project, which I've been loosely calling the Rise of Asia. Iran proved that it's no longer a matter of rocks. It's no longer a matter of, I don't know, like handheld munitions, right? Iran leveled whole neighborhoods, much of the military infrastructure of the Zionists, their research labs and institutions, like flattened, right? I don't know to what extent the US media is showing this now. It was showing it for a few days there, and the Zionists were getting very angry. And so it really, people need to recognize that this is not just an Israeli war on Iran or part of the Israeli genocide of the Palestinians. Israel is basically a glorified US military base. It is the most important outpost of US imperialism in the world. It's located at the juncture of 3 major continents and multiple bodies of water, multiple waterways, which are used often for trade, right? So this is not, Iran did not perceive itself as attacking a regional neighbor. It did not perceive itself as attacking Zionism only. It perceived itself as attacking, making a major blow to US imperialism. And it was a major blow. And when we waited with bated breath around whether or not the US would seriously engage, right? The Zionists don't breathe without the US giving them permission. So nobody should delude themselves into thinking that there's some sort of like division between the Zionists and the Americans, right? They might have disagreements. I'm sure they have tactical disagreements. They have disagreements about timing, I'm sure, but they're on the same page. They're part of the same project. And so when we were waiting to see whether or not the US would jump in any serious way to protect the Zionists, and all they could muster up was some hits on the nuclear facilities that weren't very impactful. Right now, the Iranian intelligence is saying they weren't impactful. The American intelligence apparatus is saying they weren't impactful. And so, part of it is obviously that people are saying that the facilities were so far below ground that they couldn't really effectuate any kind of heavy impacts, but also they didn't want to. We know what the US is capable of. Those who live in the US, we know what the US is capable of. It's capable of the most savage violence, the most savage and grotesque violence. It has a massive military apparatus. It could have done a lot more. It chose not to. And it chose not to, not out of goodwill, but because it's been weakened through a massive war of attrition waged largely by the peoples of West Asia, and also Russia, the Russia-NATO war, Russia versus NATO war. And then what's happening in Sudan as well. And then the rise of China and its how it's really caused blows for the US economy. So, I think it was a monumental moment. And to the extent that this imperial project can continue to fall without our region suffering massive loss of lives beyond what it's already suffered over the last 40, 45 years, I think, many of us are hopeful. Right? Many of us are hopeful. And it's thanks to the Palestinians. It's thanks to Al-Aqsa flood. And we have to continue to say that. The Iranians have said it. It is thanks to the Palestinians and to Al-Aqsa flood that this happened, to the people of Gaza that have held the Gazan resistance and maintained their steadfastness throughout this horrific genocide. I know that my own, I know that a lot of people were upset that the genocide was not effectively stopped by Iran. I too was one of those people, and I think the Iranian position, based on what I've seen and what I've read, is that there are 3 real questions or matters that need to be resolved. The first is domestic, and it's that Iran's missile defenses and radars were effective, but not as effective as they should have been. And so there's now, a lot of energy being placed there to address that problem, because the proper radar and proper defenses exist, that China has them, Russia probably has them. So it's just a matter of accessing them and also developing the indigenous technology for that. The other part of it is global, and which is something the Iranians have said, which is that the the global South states, so not the peoples of the global South, but the global South states are not adequately, have not adequately embraced the position of the axis of resistance or of Iran, which is that a two-state delusion is not tenable, right? Everybody in the region, by and large, knows this. The Zionists have certainly said it. They don't want to coexist with us. They think we're savages. They just don't, you don't coexist with people and then also commit genocide against them. And so the fact that many global South states around the world continue to put forward this two-state solution as a viable solution, that's a problem. It's a contradiction that needs to be seriously addressed. And the Iranians have said as much. It needs to be addressed at the political and diplomatic level. And then the final thing that the Iranians have said is that the idea was never to just like destroy Israel, right? The idea is to make the Zionist project unsustainable. And so part of making the project unsustainable is precisely what this last several years of resistance has done, what the last several decades of resistance has done. But also the Palestinian resistance needs to be prepared not only to hold Gaza, but to also move out of Gaza and hold the West Bank in 1948. And that is a question that is about self-reliance for the Palestinian people. They certainly know this. Nobody needs to tell them this. But the Iranians are very aware that their role in this broader project of liberation for the region is powerful, but it's limited. There have to be other players in the region. The power of other players in the region has to increase as well. And that's happening, right? It's happening, and time is always on the side of the resistance, right? Especially in a war of attrition, which is what this is. The Iranians have called this a war of attrition. It's obviously a war of attrition, and the resistance is winning. So it was a really heart-wrenching week for us. Like, I have family in Iran, a lot of family and friends. But this is it, right? This is it. And this is what it takes.
Really interesting points there. And I think, it does relate to a comment, sort of a query from Sid Barr in the chat. How might Iran's victory impact the BRICS summit taking place in Rio next week? And so that relates to that question of, the other global South states and their role, and how much are they susceptible to being convinced of the necessity of resistance, which is something that, I've kind of been mentioning in my sort of hopeful way sometimes on Twitter, that of course to no one and no one in particular, but just that if there isn't some kind of sense of a collective political project for liberation from Western imperial hegemony and recognized as such now, every other part of the world and major global South states will simply have to face what's happening now, but they will do so alone, when there's been the dismantling of other parts of the resistance. So at this point, it seems crucial that this become somehow recognized. But of course, that's a political project that's very difficult, to really, calibrate and develop. We're not in the age, and I can't even say that we're not in the age of Bandung. I mean, the spirit of Bandung was never itself fulfilled. I mean, but at least it did, kind of bring up the possibilities of global South peoples feeling that they should be involved in a collective project, against colonialism, against racism, for peace, against nuclear weapons, and so on. And it seems in some sense a people's Bandung that actually manages to enlist the power of their states in the global South is something that's just absolutely vital now. But, the sources of that, not clear. But in any case, Just wondering about any other thoughts, Alex, that you might have on this topic.
In some of our chats, I've mentioned that I'm not the biggest. I don't have a lot of hope for BRICS, and part of it is just a historical reading in past quasi similar efforts. I don't think this attempt in any way escaped some of the internal contradictions that kind of undermined earlier efforts, beginning with Bandung, beginning with the non-aligned movement, even with just inter-American organizations as well. So yeah, that BRICS meeting, there's even recently Lula voted, if I remember correctly, right? Lula voted to undermine Venezuela's attempt to become part of BRICS, right? So there's all sorts of internal political economic contradictions within BRICS that characterize previous movements that we might describe as similar. But I think Nina's point is really spot on, right? And I see it just following Mexican politics, right? The fact that the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, has really stepped back from directly denouncing the genocide in Gaza and still following this line that has existed for a while in Mexican politics about the two-state solution that has no reflection in like actual reality on the ground. But it's a way of, they think of, on the one hand, adhering to the international liberal order that, as we see, has never quite existed, right? It's one of the masks that has fallen off. But she's getting pushed, right? She's getting pushed from social movements. She's getting pushed by people within her own political coalition to be more active and more direct in the denunciation. But then, what good does a rhetorical denunciation do if you're not going to be able to follow up in practice with other similarly minded states in the global South? If anything, it's just going to attract ire from the United States, and we know that kind of matters to Mexico considering its geographic location. But I think that's what we need to see, right? In terms of the global South countries, all the global South countries have to do is to follow popular opinion in their countries, and it would serve as a dual function, right? On the one hand, it would demonstrate solidarity with the Palestinian people, the central contradiction of our times, and on the other hand, in Latin America at least, it would allow them to isolate and to attack a political right that is increasingly fascistic, and they use Israel as a symbol to organize around, politically, ideologically, and materially, right? So it'd be a nice dual move that movements and governments and from Mexico to Argentina could do it, and that's what remains to be seen. A lot of the questions that we have collectively been dealing with since Al-Aqsa flood began is a question of time and the question of time scale, and we want to see certain things happen in a particular time scale that's radically different from the time scale followed by both popular movements, by the resistance, by the axis of resistance, and by other global South states. And it's really frustrating because we are witnessing a genocide. We are witnessing children and babies starve to death. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to analytically put those things into balance, because if we believe that Palestine and Gaza are the central contradiction of our time, then you would think, okay, there has to be some sort of action beyond, right? Because we know there's action within. We see it. We see it. We see the red triangles. We see these actions that are unbelievable. We see people just surviving in the most dire of consequences. How to kind of match up these differing time scales, right? On Electronic Intifada, when Nora has interviewed Ilan Pape, he will say this is the end of Zion, this is the end of Zion, but it's the point he makes, right, is this is not according to our time scale. This is going to be horrible. This is going to be a terribly murderous time, genocidal time, and it's going to take a long time. And that's the difficulty in I think one of the difficulties in trying to be analytical about this situation. But nonetheless, we still, within the West, so-called West, we have failed. We have failed, and we have to engage with our failure to stop this genocide, because as we know, thanks to the Brown University's Cost of War project, Israel's genocide is 70% of it is funded by us, by the United States, at least, by the United States government. So Like, how do we, if we are part of the left within the United States, how do we reckon with that failure and use that as a starting point for a political and critical diagnosis of how to proceed into the future? Because we know that if we can, within the United States, within this empire, that's the one factor that could determine the end of that genocide, by simply cutting off military aid, by simply cutting off economic aid. And I think in terms of political demographics, like, I think that's the way we're headed. But again, it's a question of time scale, and it's a question of power, political power, and institutions that we're going to have to confront at some point, at some level, to get them from supporting what that one German minister a couple of weeks ago said. You know, Israel's doing our dirty work. Like, we're still going through decolonization. And when he made that comment, it should have been crystal clear to everybody what the political and military and colonial function of this entity is. And as my DC brothers always say, like, this, they are a historical anachronism, right? And they continue to do historically anachronistic things, like commit genocide in full view. But then they can whine about a punk band in Britain making a certain chant. So anyway.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Alex, and Nina, your comments earlier about, yeah, I mean, just the, holding, and not to get too like tankie therapy about it, but like holding these two part of ourselves together at the same time, where it is absolutely exhilarating to see Tel Aviv, certain neighborhoods in the Mossad headquarters and Israeli military intelligence buildings and air bases getting attacked, because that is not something that we've ever witnessed in the 80 years of this disgusting, repulsive settler colony. So feeling like, oh, finally someone's taking action, and Iran is, proved itself in those 12 days to be, an incredibly powerful force. I mean, the kind of like the cache of modern weaponry and technology that Iran had always hinted at, but we got to see it finally. And then at the same time, Israel slaughtered 900 people, mostly children during that time. And that there was no pause. There was no pause in that. And it didn't, those attacks didn't put a dent in the slaughter, in the U.S. Israeli slaughter in Gaza. And so it was like, incredibly frustrating, to not see the end of the genocide, which I don't know. I don't know if this is just, again, like naivete, where like Israel is finally getting some retribution from the 21 months of genocide that it has enacted in full view, with absolute impunity, with, all the weapons it could ever desire from the US and Germany and Canada. And then, I don't know. So it was a very like, I don't know, there was this like a struggle inside, I think, all of us watching that happen. And yet I also agree with what you said about, like, that we're on a different time scale, that we're in a point of history right now where everything, Western settler imperial colonialism, hegemony, capital is so over woven into everything now, that even Israel taking the attacks that it took, doesn't have an immediate consequence on the slaughter that it is enacting. Yet it is a war of attrition. It is one step toward the end of this genocide. It is many steps, possibly, hopefully, toward the end of this genocide and the end of Zionism, which Ilan Pappé, has prophesized, but it is really, I mean, the world has never been more repulsed by Zionism as the ideology, by Israel as the settler colonial state, by the U.S. as the engineer of it all. And I think that all the chipping away at that, at the U.S. empire itself. I mean, yeah, like you said, the U.S. could have done a lot more damage. The U.S., which is the only country in the world that has used nuclear weapons on other countries to obliterate and decimate places, could have done the same. But they did pretty much the bare minimum, without severe cost to itself in that immediate point of time. But I think it points to this like larger, slow moving, but definitely directed crumbling of the US's imperial stranglehold, at least in the West Asian region, that it can't get away with, a 2003 invasion of Iraq, style warfare anymore. That it can keep Israel as the tip of the colonial and imperial spear, but at a certain point, that's also going to cost the empire. And I think it already is. I mean, yeah, 70% of Israel's genocide was footed directly by the U.S. At a certain point, I don't know if that's going to be sustainable. I don't think so. And I think the more that there is popular revolt, that there are more governments, especially in Europe, who can, put different wrenches in the gears of the U.S.-Israeli war machine, I think it'll be harder and harder for the U.S. to sustain the settler colony. And especially as Zionism is eating itself, and as settlers are leaving in droves, as that entity becomes less and less sustainable itself, I think Iran is right. I think the war of attrition is going steadily forward, and it's just a matter of time. But it's like, what is going to happen to Gaza in that time? And that's the real, I think it makes us all sick to our stomach that still, and yet Gaza is the inferno that just keeps burning, literally. And no one's stopping it. Yemen, of course, we have to give our salute to Yemen for maintaining its blockade, for keeping the settlers in their bunkers, and yet it can't just be Yemen and sometimes Iran. Somehow there has to be a tipping point before it's too late.
Yeah, it is. As a person of our time, it is just too painful to see the Palestinians being the sacrifice for this process of decolonization. I mean, they've embraced resistance, but it's just so painful. As a historian, however, that issue of timescale is quite interesting. I mean, as a scholar of medieval Mediterranean and Crusade history, I mean, I think of, in fact, actually the Crusader states that were established after the First Crusade as the real direct analogy for the Zionist settler colonial project. And those lasted in a period where history, maybe you could say, moved in slower rhythms, 192 3 years. It hasn't been that long yet, but the clock is ticking. We'll just see how accelerated. And the real question is what can we do in the meantime? And so I did want to turn to a patron question that had been submitted earlier that relates to this. And while I'm doing so, just remind people who are on the stream, like the stream so others can get a hold of this great discussion that we've been having with Nora, Alex, and Nina, and subscribe to the channel. But Ricky had posted that the left has been so thoroughly dismembered and traumatized in the metropole that I fear we ourselves woefully underprepared to mount an effective resistance campaign against empire at scale. Sort of referring to what Alex has been saying about, we have to acknowledge and wrestle and struggle with the failures of our movements. Question is, what would be effective? It continues, where and how do we accelerate building the foundation of opposition, and how do we inspire people to fight in the face of unprecedented repression and state violence? Or are we stuck, waiting for the dialectics of the moment to catch up with the live-streamed genocide? So I'd like to put that to you for your, responses to that, and just also remind us that among the more, the demonstrations haven't worked. A lot of the other things people have been doing have not had the kind of impact that people hope for in stopping the genocide. And one of the most effective direct action campaigns, against Elbit systems and associated financial institutions, suppliers, supporters, Palestine Action in the UK, has been effective, at least is in eliciting, severe repression. And we're seeing that, they're being criminalized in the UK as a so-called terrorist organization. So that's the sort of unprecedented repression and state violence that we can, sort of expect. But I'm wondering what you thought about basically that fundamental question. I mean, how to be more effective in this time in trying to stop the genocide, resist the genocide, or at least our part in light of the resistance taking place in West Asia. They are the principal actors, but what kind of solidarity work could be more effective? What should we be thinking about in response to Ricky's question? Anyone? I know it's a tough one.
I don't have any answers. Sorry, Ricky. But, I think to add another layer of complexity to this is that we're all, at least within the US, maybe some Western European countries, we're also in an era without mass politics, or at least the very idea and organization of mass politics that can have a direct impact on the people that rule us, right? And I think that's maybe another starting point for us to think about how to move forward. That would be the ultimate mask off moment, right? The last mask we shed in the United States is to acknowledge that we don't live in any sort of democracy. We have some semblance, we have a pantomime, right? But as we're witnessing right now with these ICE terrorist campaigns in places like Southern California, where we have U.S. citizens getting picked up just because of the color of their skin and then getting disappeared for a couple of days. There's like the U.S. has always been, U.S. so-called democracy has always been a state of exception. I think one way we can think about how to move forward is to be, part of this is extremely risky, right? So what Palestine Action has done is extremely risky. What community defense, self-defense organizations in Southern California have done is extremely risky, right? It brings great legal cost to individuals who are engaging in these. And I think we have to be honest about that. And we have to be, and the costs are so grave that perhaps that's one of the reasons why our move is always toward electoral politics, or in the last few years, union organizing, which I think at this point, I think we have to adopt all sorts of methodologies. It's not just one, right? I think we need a combination of all forms of struggle as a way of trying to achieve some sort of political success or victory in the United States. But, following the stuff that's been happening in Southern California, it's when state power like affects you directly that people start to get radicalized, when people start to think, wait, this is not right that like, my homeboy living next door is getting beat up by a LA Sheriff's Department deputy. And you may be the most apolitical person in the world, but that will politicize you in the moment. So like, how do we start organizing and catalyzing movements at the local and city level around the issue of something like ICE, around the issue of this particular form of right-wing authoritarian politics that Trump represents, and then building from that and making connections geographically and globally, I think is one of the challenges that we face. I get requests to do like Spanish language radio interviews or media interviews, and usually I get asked to do this. The producer who will contact me is because they'll be like, we don't really have many other people we can draw on to make those connections between the global and the local. So I think that's also a useful reminder, right? Like we need to also think about political organizing and political and intellectual work, like beyond just like in the United States, at least, like just beyond just like the English language, right? Like that also represents like it reflects like what U.S. society has become and is changing. And I think that's one of the challenges as well. Like, how do you organize across communities that look different, that speak differently, that may be apolitical, but because of the stuff that's going on today, they're becoming radically politicized. And in many instances, they're taking action, they're acting to defend their communities. So can we think of a way or ways that serves as some sort of base from which to reactivate a mass politics that can put a little fear into the rich people that are ruling us today? I think another thing to think about is that Trump, one of the ways that I read Trump's the military strikes that he ordered against Iran and their inefficiency, their short duration, is that I do think that his political base and people that are around him, they're much more interested in waging domestic war, not international war, right? And this is what so if that's the case, then we really need to focus on how that domestic war is unfolding here, organize and move and think and act appropriately, but while also trying to make connections to what's going on with U.S. empire abroad. But yeah, we're like, this is like, we're at the zero, right? Like we need to, at least like I'm talking about like as a hapless wannabe so-called intellectual, right? Because there's people on the ground doing stuff. It's part of this, it involves us, like as this, in this world of podcasting or intellectual work, like what are we like, how can we kind of interface and get engaged with some of these movements?
That's a great question, and one that I hope maybe in our last few minutes when we get there, maybe we'll have some suggestions for ways to get involved with certain organizations, campaigns, movements, and so on. But Nora.
Yeah, I mean, just seeing the kind of spontaneous ad hoc organizing in Southern California. I can't remember exactly what city it was, Bell or Torrance, I can't remember. But like even the local, like the city firefighters got involved, and they forced the ICE trucks like to kind of scatter, because the fire trucks have the right of way when they have their sirens blaring and everything. And then there were like community, the entire community came out and chased ICE out. And that, yeah, it was Bell. And I just think that like that is something that, your local DSA chapter or whatever wouldn't have organized, spontaneously. It happened because people in the community were seeing their friends and neighbors and coworkers, being hunted by this Gestapo force. And so I think taking whatever that energy is called, whatever we can call that energy, community defense, and looking at that and saying like, how can this like tiny little, Southern California town do this? Can we do that in places like Oakland and New York City, and, really, really making it difficult for the Gestapo to do their kidnapping. I think that is something that that I think is hopeful in this time. And at these community defense kidnappings, there's also I've seen it every single one, signs and Palestine flags, people really linking it to what's happening in Palestine, to this like the strangulation of by empire of people, indigenous people, brown people, marginalized people, and I think that's happening, that's occurring naturally, and that's that just needs to be again expanded and amplified. And I think one of the worst things, I mean, there are so many just heinous, watching a live stream genocide for 21 months now, from 10,000 miles away from the belly of the beast, the feeling of helplessness, of watching this happen to people without any way of materially stopping it, I think is just one of the most like psychologically debilitating things for people here. And I think one thing that for me has been really important to kind of cut through that helplessness is supporting mutual aid organizations on the ground in Gaza. So whether it's like GLIA, the medical solidarity organization that's there, whether it is the Samir Project, which is absolutely incredible, which is chefs and teachers and community organizers and cultural workers and drivers and kitchen workers coming together to not just try and feed people, but also house them and clothe them and put on classes for kids and try to address just an inch of the psychological trauma. I think that has been, to keep donating to these organizations is really important, because that's something we can do. And I think not, not letting the helplessness kind of overtake you is really important. I mean, I see it all the time where people are just like, well, what can I do? I'm just going to turn off. I'm not even going to engage because it's too painful. And I think that is a luxury that we cannot afford to employ. I think that is a luxury of capitalism. It's a luxury of being in the belly of the beast, and we can't do that. We have, as painful as it is, yes, it is painful. Yes, it is the worst thing that we've ever seen in our lives, but we can't turn it off. And so channeling it into these mutual aid organizations, there's the We Are Not Numbers project, which pairs writers in Gaza up with people all over the world who can, edit and work on, write essays and poems together. I think that has been really, really making these connections. I think building solidarity in ways that are material is going to be the thing until Zionism collapses in on itself, because it is happening, and we can't. If the Palestinians haven't given up, we cannot give up.
Yes. And I think you already started giving us some of the organizations. You mentioned the Samir Project and the collaboration with writers and a number of great things. And we will try and put links to all of these in the description for people to follow up on afterwards. But I want to turn to Nina for any other remarks on Ricky's question and also where it might take her in terms of suggestions for action.
So my I said this, I think, earlier, Adnan, you've heard this. My whole life, I was born right after the Iranian Revolution and right before the Iran-Iraq War. Yeah, my whole life, our region has been on fire. I mean, it's like a whole life. I'm almost 46. It's a whole life. It's a half a century of violence and instability and so and then sort of when I went off to college, you couldn't utter the word Palestine without getting seriously attacked by colleagues in the classroom, sometimes professor, whatever, right? And so I despite what we're seeing on our phones every day, I think we're really, this is far better. This moment is far better than anything that the region has experienced over the last several decades, because there's a resistance, and there's a resistance that has not given up an inch of land, right? Land is life. The Palestinians know that. The indigenous nations here in the US know that land is life. And so long as the Palestinians continue to hold their land, so long as the Lebanese continue to hold that land, so long as the Iranians continue to hold control of that state, which holds control of the land, this project is at its very last stages. And so I think it's really important. I'm a historian, and so I guess it's easy for me to say this, right? But it takes time. It takes time to win. We in the United States, we're accustomed to thinking about a 5-year plan, maybe a 10-year plan, right? I don't even think the capitalist class thinks beyond like 10, 15, 20, I don't know. That's not how time operates in societies in Asia. They're thinking 100 years ahead. I think the Chinese Communist project has proven that. They've proven that like Asian societies, these are societies that have been around thousands of years, and they're thinking on a different scale. So I'm very hopeful about the region. I'm very hopeful about the eastern half of the world. I am less hopeful about this particular half of the world. And I will say, I agree wholeheartedly with everything that everybody else has said. I'll just add that I think we need to accept the fact that the left here, it's too late, right? Like, it's just too late. It was destroyed, it was decimated. We can sort of write books about all that, like talk about it, but it's too late, right? On the practical scale. I think the US is looking at a civil war. It's not uncommon for empires to collapse into civil wars. They often do. In fact, they almost always do. And so I think that the left needs to think about what that means, right? Is there going to be a civil war? If you follow the law, if you follow what Congress is doing, if you follow what the Supreme Court is doing, it kind of looks like it, right? Federalism is collapsing unto itself. And so if it's true there's going to be a civil war, does that mean that the US will be balkanized, as often happens to empires at the end? And if it's going to be balkanized, then what does that mean for the indigenous nations here? What does that mean for Black people who have been calling for land rights? What does that mean for all the land that once belonged to Mexico, right? Like, I think we need to think on a level of different horizons, right? Assuming that what has happened to most empires will happen to this one. And I'll just end with a quote from Lenin that was on my desk. I don't know why. I put this on a piece of paper on notes from a long time
Well, why
ago.
not? Why not?
Yeah, so I'll just end with it. And this is from Collected Works, his Collective Works, volume 16. Quote, despair is typical of those who do not understand that the causes of evil, see no way out, and are incapable of struggle. And so I think the point is not to judge those who feel despair, because I certainly have, we all have, but to say that if you look at the struggle, if you focus on the struggle, the amount of struggle we are witnessing right now, both here and around the world, there's no room for despair. There's just no room for it. So
that's a perfect quotation for a struggle session, I have to say.
So good.
Alex, I wondered if you had any other final thoughts and, things you wanted to highlight, and encourage listeners and viewers to take note of, participate in, get engaged with, support. If you had any.
That was a perfect ending. I don't want to ruin it. So
That
listen to our episode that's going to come out with Adnan, and I have another one with Sina about LA, and where we interview a freelance journalist who was there in LA a couple weeks ago when it popped off in Paramount. So no, that was great, the way to end that Nina provided for us. So
she did indeed. So do check out that episode both on East as a podcast, and then there's one that will come out on this channel with Alex about the LA uprisings and anti-ICE resistance. I guess since I have to close out, I will do a quick shout out, however, because I was minded by that Matt Getz recognition of U.S. wars abroad creating, and U.S. depredations and empire and intervention, whether it's in Latin America or West Asia, causing, people to have to leave their homelands against their, wishes and migrating elsewhere, that I did want to just highlight an organization that is close to my heart because it was founded by my mother 35 years ago. That's called Rahima Foundation. It's in the Bay Area. You can go donate, rahima.org. And while, charitable organization, charity is not like the solution that we look to, it is something that, in the midst of such pain and misery that is surrounding people, that there's some practical things we can do to try and contribute to giving a little bit of hope and to being resilient in the struggle. So it started with refugees, principally from U.S. wars, and like the Iraq War, Afghanistan war, that came to the Bay Area. And so I'd just like to highlight that for people if they want to do something locally. But of course, all of those other fundraisers, and I know Sina has been championing a fundraiser for Muhammad in Gaza. We'll also put the link, for that in the description. And I just want to thank everyone who's participated. First, of course, I want to thank my guests, the panelists, for their amazingly incisive and valuable remarks, their analysis. It's really been helpful, I think. I hope you've found it helpful. But I also want to thank people who have come to the stream and who've contributed on the chat. I didn't always bring things into the discussion here from the chat, but I've been trying to follow it, and a lot of remarkable points being made by people. This is the reason why we wanted to start a live stream kind of panel session, so that there could be this audience engagement, interaction, and discussion together, and to form some sense of community. And it is even small things like this, like all those organizations that Nora was talking about. They not only do some good, but they also build connections and solidarity that is a resource that goes beyond just the work that you do, but it's creating that sense of community. So I want to thank you for participating in this community, and this is something we'll be doing regularly. We'll have these guests back on, a whole bunch of others, and I just want to, again, wish you all peace and solidarity in our struggles for a better world. Thanks so much, everyone.